Somewhere in early childhood, long before you had the vocabulary to understand what was happening, you were already doing something most children never learn to do at all. You were reading rooms, not playing in them, not simply existing in them the way children are supposed to, carefree, oblivious to the emotional undercurrents swirling around adults who assumed they were invisible. You were reading them, sensing the tension before the argument started, feeling the sadness behind someone's forced smile, understanding, on some instinctive level, exactly what everyone in the room needed from you before they even realized they needed it themselves. And here's the sentence that's going to change how you understand your entire life if you let it sink in fully. You were never born broken, needing to learn how to heal. You were born to heal everyone except yourself. That distinction is everything. And once you understand it, you'll finally understand why healing has always felt so much harder for you than it seems to look for everyone else. Let's start with the truth. Almost nobody tells empaths, especially not the well-meaning therapists, healers, and self-help books that keep insisting your journey is about learning to heal, as if healing is simply a skill you haven't mastered yet, a technique you need to practice until you finally get it right. You already know how to heal. You've known since childhood. It's the one thing you've always been effortlessly, almost supernaturally good at, sensing exactly what a wounded person needs, offering exactly the right words at exactly the right moment, holding space for pain so heavy most people would run from it without ever flinching, without ever making it about yourself. The problem was never your capacity to heal. The problem is that you were taught systematically, over years, sometimes decades, that this capacity only counts when it's aimed outward, that your worth lives entirely in what you can offer other people, that the moment you turn that same healing energy toward yourself, you become selfish, self-indulgent, somehow less generous than the version of you who gives endlessly to everyone, except the one person who has never once received the same depth of care. This is the wound underneath the wound. This is the reason empaths so often spend years in relationships with narcissists, absorbing damage that was never theirs to carry, extending compassion to people who never once considered extending it back. Not because empaths don't know how to protect themselves, but because somewhere along the way, protecting themselves started to feel like betraying the very identity they'd built their entire sense of worth around. Think about how this pattern actually forms, because it rarely starts in adulthood. It starts young, often absurdly young, in households where a child becomes attuned to a parent's moods not out of curiosity but out of necessity. Maybe you were the child who could sense your mother's depression before she ever said a word about it, who learned to be quiet, helpful, undemanding, because your own needs felt like an unbearable burden added onto a household already straining under the weight of unspoken pain. Maybe you were the child who mediated between fighting parents, who somehow became the emotional glue holding together a family system that was never actually your responsibility to hold. This is where the wiring begins. This is where a child's natural sensitivity, a gift, genuinely an extraordinary capacity for empathy that most people never develop to the same degree, gets redirected entirely outward, weaponized against its own owner, taught that its highest purpose is service to everyone else's emotional survival, regardless of the cost to your own. And here's the devastating part, the part that explains everything that came afterward. A child who learns this lesson early doesn't just carry it into one relationship. She carries it into every relationship, every friendship, every professional dynamic, searching unconsciously for the same familiar role she learned to play so young. The healer, the fixer, the one whose love is measured entirely by how much pain she's willing to absorb on someone else's behalf. This is precisely why narcissists find empaths so effortlessly, so reliably, across every stage of life. They're not hunting randomly. They're recognizing a very specific signature, someone whose sense of worth is deeply tied to being needed, someone who has spent an entire lifetime believing that healing other people is not just something she's good at, but the primary reason she exists at all. And once that dynamic activates inside a relationship, something devastating happens that most empaths don't fully understand until years later, often not until they're already standing in the wreckage of a relationship that took everything and gave almost nothing back. Because a narcissist doesn't just receive an empath's healing energy the way a genuinely wounded, growth-oriented person might. He consumes it. He treats her boundless capacity for compassion not as a precious gift to be honored, but as an inexhaustible resource to be mined indefinitely, without any real intention of ever doing the internal work that might actually justify the investment she keeps making in his potential. This is where the exhaustion begins to accumulate. Not from any single devastating betrayal, but from years of pouring healing energy into someone incapable of receiving it in any meaningful, transformative way. Because real healing requires reciprocity. It requires the person receiving care to eventually do something with it, to grow, to change, to meet the compassion being offered with genuine effort of their own. A narcissist offers none of that. He simply keeps receiving indefinitely while she keeps giving indefinitely until something inside her finally, quietly starts to break. And this is where we arrive at the real question underneath everything we've discussed so far. The question this entire title is actually asking: if empaths were never born to heal themselves in the traditional sense, if their entire nature is oriented outward toward other people's pain rather than their own, does that mean self-healing is somehow unnatural for them? Does that mean they're destined to keep giving everything away forever with nothing left over to direct toward their own wounds? The answer to that question is going to completely reshape how you think about your own healing journey moving forward, because it's not what you've been taught to believe. And understanding the real answer is the exact thing that finally breaks the cycle, keeping so many empaths trapped in relationships that were never worthy of everything they gave. The truth is this: empaths were never meant to heal themselves the way everyone else does. They were meant to heal themselves the way they've always healed everyone else, which means the entire framework you've been given for your own recovery has probably been wrong from the very beginning. Here's what almost every healing resource gets fundamentally backwards when it comes to empaths. Most healing advice is built for people whose default setting is self-focus, who need to learn empathy, compassion, and outward awareness as skills they don't naturally possess. This is why so much conventional advice centers around things like practicing self-compassion, learning to sit with your feelings, developing emotional awareness, skills an empath has possessed, often at an almost expert level since childhood. Telling an empath to practice self-compassion the way you'd tell a typically self-focused person is like telling a professional musician to practice recognizing musical notes. She's not missing the skill. She's missing permission to use a skill she already has, expertly, in the one direction she's never been allowed to point it. This reframe changes everything about how healing actually needs to work for someone with your particular nature. You don't need to learn compassion. You need to learn to redirect the compassion you already possess in abundance toward the one person who has been quietly, systematically excluded from receiving it for your entire life, yourself. This might sound simple when stated this way, but the actual practice of it is one of the most disorienting, uncomfortable experiences an empath will ever go through, precisely because it contradicts everything you were taught, implicitly, from childhood onward, about where your value actually comes from. Because here's what happens the first time an empath genuinely tries to turn her healing gift inward. It doesn't feel natural. It doesn't feel like relief. It feels disturbingly like betrayal, as if choosing yourself, even briefly, even in some small, reasonable way, is somehow a theft from all the people who have come to depend on your endless outward availability. This guilt isn't a character flaw. It's a conditioned response, built over years of receiving explicit and implicit messages that your worth is measured by your usefulness to others. Every time you consider prioritizing your own healing, a part of you, trained since childhood, sounds an alarm. Who will take care of everyone else if you're busy taking care of yourself? But here's the truth that dismantles that alarm completely, once you understand it deeply enough to actually believe it. An empath who never learns to heal herself doesn't become more available to help others in any sustainable way. She becomes progressively more depleted, more resentful, more prone to attracting exactly the kind of people who will exploit her boundless outward focus without ever considering what she might need in return. Eventually, she has nothing left to give anyone, including the people who genuinely deserved her care in the first place. Self-healing for an empath isn't selfishness. It's the only thing that makes her outward gift sustainable over an entire lifetime, rather than a resource that eventually burns out completely, leaving nothing behind for anyone, including herself. This reframe leads to something even more important: understanding what self-healing actually looks like for someone whose entire nature is oriented outward. Because it doesn't look like isolation, like withdrawing from the world, like becoming someone who stops caring about other people's pain in order to finally focus on her own. That would be just another form of self-abandonment, simply relabeled as self-care. Real healing for an empath means learning to apply the exact same depth of attention she's always given everyone else, finally, to herself. It means noticing her own emotional state with the same careful attunement she's always used to notice other people's moods. It means holding space for her own grief, her own anger, her own exhaustion, with the same patience and non-judgment she's always extended to people who never once returned the favor. This is profoundly different from simply learning boundaries, though boundaries matter enormously in this process. It's about recognizing that the boundless compassion you've always had wasn't misplaced. It was simply incomplete, missing an entire dimension it was never given permission to develop. The dimension where that same depth of care gets turned toward the person who has needed it most all along, without ever receiving it. And this is where the real transformation begins. Because once an empath starts directing her healing gift inward, even imperfectly, even with all the discomfort and guilt that initially accompanies it, something remarkable starts to happen to her outward relationships as well. She stops being drawn to people who need endless fixing. She stops mistaking her own exhaustion for love. She starts recognizing, almost instantly now, the difference between someone who genuinely wants to grow and someone who simply wants an inexhaustible source of care without any intention of ever reciprocating it. This shift doesn't happen because she's learned some entirely new skill from scratch. It happens because she's finally applying a skill she's always possessed, expertly, in a direction that was always meant to include herself, but never actually did until she chose, deliberately, painfully, to make it so. And once that inclusion becomes complete, once she finally learns to heal herself with the same devotion she's always offered everyone else, something happens that changes not just her relationship with herself, but her entire understanding of what she was actually put on this earth to do in the first place. Because here's what finally becomes clear. Once the self-healing work has genuinely taken root, empaths were never meant to be self-sacrificing healers, pouring themselves out until nothing remains. They were meant to be something far more powerful and far more sustainable, whole healers, capable of offering genuine care to others precisely because that same care has already been fully established within themselves first. This distinction changes everything about how an empath understands her own purpose. For years, maybe your entire life, you believed your value was measured by how much you could give away, how much pain you could absorb, how endlessly available you could remain to everyone who needed something from you. And underneath that belief lived an exhausting, unspoken assumption that giving to yourself somehow diminished your capacity to give to others, that self-care and other care existed in permanent competition, with only a finite amount of compassion to distribute between them. But this was never actually true. It was simply the lie you were taught, repeatedly, by every relationship that benefited from you believing it. Because real compassion isn't a finite resource that depletes when directed toward yourself. It's a muscle that strengthens with practice, regardless of which direction it's aimed. An empath who learns to heal herself doesn't become less capable of healing others. She becomes infinitely more capable because she's no longer operating from depletion, resentment, or unconscious need for validation disguised as generosity. This is the version of you the narcissist never got to meet and never will, because this version simply cannot exist within the confines of a relationship built on one-directional extraction. This version of you understands something that took years of pain, exhaustion, and painful self-discovery to finally learn: that healing yourself isn't a betrayal of your gift, it's the completion of it. Think about what it actually means to be fully healed as an empath, not partially healed, not healed everywhere except in your relationship with yourself, but genuinely, completely whole. It means you can offer comfort to a grieving friend without absorbing her grief as your own indefinitely. It means you can hold space for someone's pain without losing yourself inside it, because you have a well-established relationship with your own boundaries, your own needs, your own capacity for self-restoration after giving deeply to someone else. It means, perhaps most importantly, that you finally stop being exploitable in the way you once were. Not because you've closed yourself off from caring about people, but because your caring finally comes from a place of genuine abundance rather than desperate, unconscious need. Narcissists cannot effectively feed on someone who isn't operating from depletion. They need your emptiness, your exhaustion, your unmet need for validation in order for their extraction to work. A fully healed empath, someone whose own cup has finally been filled by her own hand, simply doesn't offer that same vulnerability anymore. This is why the healed empath becomes such an unusual, almost unprecedented figure in the world. Someone who retains every ounce of the compassion, the sensitivity, the deep capacity for connection that always defined her, while no longer being susceptible to the exploitation that once made those same qualities so dangerous to possess. She becomes proof that the two things you were always told couldn't coexist, boundless compassion and unshakable self-protection, were never actually contradictory at all. They were simply incomplete without each other, waiting for her entire life to finally be integrated into a single whole person. And this finally brings us back to the truth this entire conversation has been building toward, the sentence that started everything and now finally makes complete sense. Empaths were never born to heal in the way most people understand that phrase, if healing means fixing something broken from birth. You were born already knowing how to heal. That knowledge has lived inside you since childhood, expressed itself through every wounded person you've ever comforted, every pain you've ever sensed before it was spoken aloud, every moment you offered exactly the right presence to someone who desperately needed it. The only thing you were never taught, the only piece that was ever actually missing, was permission to turn that extraordinary gift toward yourself. And now that you finally have it, now that you understand your own healing was never a betrayal of who you are, but the fullest, most complete expression of it, nothing can take that gift away from you again. Not a narcissist who convinced you your compassion belonged only to him. Not a childhood that taught you your needs came last. Not years of exhaustion that made you forget you were ever allowed to receive the same depth of care you've always so freely given away. You were always the healer. You simply forgot for a while that healing was allowed to include you too.